It was July 18th, 2007, a Thursday, the kind of day where the air feels heavier than it should, soaked in humidity and quiet tension. Hollow Ridge, Tennessee, isn't a place most people have heard of. A scattered patchwork of farmland, deep woods, and the kind of gravel roads that never got a second layer. That afternoon, 73-year-old Evelyn Mercer sat on her front porch, like she always did when the heat peaked and the cicadas started to buzz. Her white wicker chair creaked as she leaned back, her palms resting gently on the armrests, ankles crossed beneath a faded house dress. It was her habit. Same time every day, same chair, same quiet gaze across the driveway and fields beyond. Her daughter, Janet, was inside folding laundry, pausing every so often to glance through the screen door. At 2:46 p.m., she stepped outside with a sweating glass of iced tea, placing it on the small table next to Evelyn with a gentle smile and a few words, something about dinner or the mail, nothing unusual. Evelyn didn't say much in return. She never did. She just nodded, murmured something soft, and turned her face back to the tree line that bordered the property. 15 minutes later, Janet came back outside. Evelyn was gone. Not just gone from the porch. Gone, as in vanished. The chair was still swaying slightly, the tea untouched, beads of condensation still sliding down the glass. At first, Janet assumed her mother had gone around the side of the house, maybe to check the garden beds or visit the chicken coop out back. She called out, casually at first, then again, louder, then louder still. By 3:20, she was screaming. The Mercer farmhouse sits on 10 acres of land, hemmed in on all sides by dense forest. There's no visible neighbor for almost half a mile. The porch has one set of stairs and no ramp. Evelyn had arthritis in both knees. She moved slowly. That alone made what came next impossible to comprehend. Janet called 911 at 3:32 p.m., her voice barely coherent. Sheriff's deputies arrived just after 4 a.m. They searched the house first, every room, every closet, the basement, then the property. No broken windows, no open doors, no signs of forced entry or struggle. Evelyn's bedroom was untouched. Her purse was still inside, her medications lined up on the bathroom counter, untouched since morning. Her shoes, the only pair she regularly wore, were still by the back door. She had been wearing slippers, thin-soled, tan-colored, open back. By nightfall, more officers had arrived. A helicopter circled overhead with a spotlight as dusk fell. Volunteers from the county fire department brought floodlights, walking the fields in organized lines. Dogs were brought in, trained to detect both live scent and cadaver scent. Nothing. Not a single footprint in the soft dirt leading away from the porch. No drag marks, no tire tracks on the gravel drive. The chair still rocked slightly in the warm breeze. Janet was interviewed for over an hour that night, her hands trembling, eyes distant. She told the same story over and over again. She had been inside, folding laundry. She hadn't heard a vehicle, no voices, no scream, just 15 minutes. That's all it took. 15 minutes. Investigators ran through the possibilities. Could Evelyn have wandered off into the woods, maybe had a stroke, became disoriented? But even that didn't explain the lack of any physical evidence. No broken branches, no rustle in the brush, no scent trail. She wasn't a small woman. She couldn't have moved far, and certainly not in complete silence. Sheriff's deputies canvassed the area into the early hours of the morning. A roadblock was set up at the end of Hollow Ridge Road, checking every vehicle. No one reported seeing an elderly woman walking along the roads. No one had noticed anything strange. It was like the woods had swallowed her whole. The next morning, detectives expanded the perimeter. Search teams moved out into the bordering woods, every inch combed. Bloodhounds retraced the path from the porch to the field, then stopped. The trail ended, dead, right at the base of the steps. By day 3, search and rescue crews from 3 counties were involved. They used ATVs, thermal drones, and aerial surveillance. Still, nothing. And then, slowly, the search began to shrink. Interest waned, the headlines faded, theories filled the vacuum, animal attack, dementia, abduction, but each one broke down under scrutiny. Evelyn was sharp, she wasn't frail, and no signs, none, pointed to any struggle or break-in. Janet refused to leave the property. For weeks, she barely ate. She slept in Evelyn's room. She sat on the same porch every day, waiting. Sometimes she talked into the woods, whispering things she used to tell her mother. It was as if she believed, somewhere just beyond the tree line, Evelyn might be listening. But no one ever came out of the woods. No sign was ever found, no body, no sound. And as the weeks stretched into months, Evelyn Mercer became another story whispered through the rural South, of a woman who vanished in plain sight in the middle of the day from her own front porch. The kind of story that doesn't feel real until it happens to someone you know. But the land never forgets. And 18 years later, after a storm would rip through Hollow Ridge, something buried deep beneath the Mercer farm would finally come to the surface. By the second day, the Mercer farmhouse was surrounded by marked vehicles, folding tables, maps spread across truck hoods, and men and women in reflective vests moving in and out of the woods like a slow, methodical machine. Hollow Ridge had never seen anything like it. State police had joined the investigation. K-9 teams were brought in from Nashville. Helicopters circled with infrared cameras. A mobile command center was set up in the church parking lot 2 miles down the road. They searched in grids, moving outward in expanding rings, hoping Evelyn had simply wandered too far. But each hour that passed without a trace made that theory harder to believe. The terrain surrounding the Mercer property was dense, woods choked with underbrush, jagged creek beds, and overgrown fence lines from a time when people still tried to keep nature out. It should have made tracking easier. Slippers don't leave clean prints in soft dirt without some sign of drag or scuff. But the earth gave nothing back. Dogs caught a faint scent at the bottom of the porch stairs, then lost it within 30 feet, as if it simply stopped. By day 3, volunteers began arriving from neighboring counties, farmers, retirees, off-duty EMTs. They brought water bottles, GPS trackers, and a quiet kind of urgency that said they understood time was running out. They scoured the area in teams of 5. They checked abandoned barns, storm drains, root cellars. Nothing. Even the dogs seemed confused. Theories began to surface. Some were whispered by neighbors, others discussed openly by investigators under their breath. Could she have been taken? Maybe by someone who knew the area, someone who could have slipped in and out without being seen. But there was no sign of a vehicle near the house, no tracks in the driveway. The gravel was dry and undisturbed. Others suggested a wildlife encounter, a bear maybe, or a coyote pack. But there was no blood, no torn fabric, and Evelyn was not a small woman. She couldn't have been dragged off without some evidence left behind. On the 4th day, a neighbor came forward. She'd been driving past the Mercer property around 2:30 p.m. the day Evelyn vanished. Said she'd noticed an older model pickup truck idling just beyond the tree line across the road. She didn't see the driver's face, only the vehicle. Faded red paint. No visible plates. The information was logged, a sketch was drawn, and bolos were issued to surrounding counties. But no truck matching the description was ever found. As each day passed, the mood at the command center shifted, from urgency to confusion, from confusion to frustration. The Mercer family hovered on the edges of every search party, offering suggestions, pointing out old paths Evelyn might have taken. Janet barely slept. Her hands shook constantly. Her brother Brian flew in from Texas on day 5. He paced the porch like he expected Evelyn to step back out at any moment, barefoot and laughing. By day 7, the media arrived. Satellite vans, local anchors, true crime podcasters. The story of the grandmother who vanished from her porch began circulating online. Evelyn's church pastor organized a candlelight vigil that Sunday. Half the county showed up. They prayed, passed out flyers, and repeated the same question that had no answer. How does someone disappear like that? Law enforcement continued running down leads. A few hikers reported finding old items in the woods, a sock, a scrap of cloth, an empty water bottle, but none belonged to Evelyn. Thermal drones flew night after night, no heat signatures, no shelters, no sign of life or death. Eventually, the search radius expanded to 10 miles. It was a formality. By then, everyone knew they weren't going to find her walking out of the trees. The working theory shifted again. Maybe she had some kind of episode. Maybe she'd tried to find help and fallen into one of the deep sinkholes scattered throughout the region. A few of them were explored with cameras. Still nothing. 10 days in, the official search was suspended. Resources had dried up. Other emergencies needed attention. Deputies apologized. They said they'd done everything they could, that sometimes people just vanish. The Mercer family didn't accept that. Janet refused to leave the farmhouse. She became skeletal over the following weeks. She barely spoke. At night, she kept a lamp on the porch, just in case Evelyn found her way back. Brian stayed for another month, then left abruptly after an argument with local police. He said they'd given up too soon. He said no one was asking the right questions, but he didn't offer any answers either. The red pickup sighting remained a loose thread. It never led anywhere. No one came forward. No similar vehicles were tied to known offenders in the area. It became just another detail lost in the stack of case files labeled unsolved. And as the search ended and the crowds faded, the silence around Hollow Ridge deepened. The farmhouse sat quiet again, but not peaceful. A heaviness clung to the land, the kind that made visitors stop talking as they approached the porch. Something had happened there, something that didn't leave a mark, not on the ground, not in the house, just in the air, and in the people who were left behind. Still, some part of Janet refused to believe her mother had simply vanished. She believed there was something missing, something no one had found yet, and deep down, she knew the land would give it up eventually. It just had to be forced. By the time summer rolled around again, the Mercer farmhouse hadn't changed, not in any way that mattered. The siding was beginning to peel, the porch paint was flaking in long white strips, and the roof sagged slightly near the back bedroom. But the real weight pressing down on the house wasn't from weather. It came from the silence, the kind that grows deeper with each season. Evelyn's wicker chair still sat in the exact same spot, angled slightly toward the fields. No one had touched it, not once. It had become a kind of monument, not just to her, but to the unanswered question that had come to define the Mercer family. Janet still lived there. She refused to move. Refused to change the curtains, refused to cover the porch light that had burned out months ago. She left Evelyn's room exactly the same. Bed made, slippers by the door, hairbrush on the dresser. She told friends she wasn't ready to let go. But the truth was, she didn't know how. In the months after Evelyn disappeared, she'd followed every lead, filed more missing persons notices, sent emails to reporters, called psychics when she thought no one was listening, but nothing ever came of it. No more sightings, no more tips, no evidence, no remains, just the chair, just the iced tea glass still in the cupboard, the one she hadn't used since that day. In June of 2008, a new detective was assigned to the case, a man named Carter Myers, young, methodical, freshly transferred from Nashville. He went through the original reports line by line, cross-referencing weather patterns, search maps, even postal records to determine any nearby activity the day Evelyn vanished. But it was a file buried in the coroner's supplemental notes that caught his attention. A doctor's report, dated 6 months prior to the disappearance, noting Evelyn had shown signs of early cognitive decline. Not Alzheimer's, not diagnosed dementia, just some confusion, trouble remembering where she put her keys, repeating stories, the kind of things people her age often brush off. But Myers saw a theory forming, not foul play, not abduction, but accidental disappearance, a simple case of an elderly woman slipping away on her own. The problem was, it didn't sit right with everyone, especially not with Evelyn's granddaughter, Lila. She had just turned 16 when her grandmother disappeared, and she remembered that day in vivid detail. She and Evelyn had spoken on the phone that morning, around 10. Evelyn had asked about her exam schedule, reminded her to wear sunscreen, laughed at something Lila couldn't even remember now. She hadn't sounded confused, not tired, not scattered, just like Evelyn. But the narrative had already begun to shift. The new detective made his rounds, gently pushing the angle of cognitive decline. To the department, it made sense. It was the cleanest explanation left standing. Elderly woman, early dementia, rural setting, wooded property, no signs of foul play. It fit the model. It let people sleep easier. Janet resisted the theory. Quietly at first, then with increasing desperation. She told anyone who would listen that her mother didn't wander, that she wasn't the type to just leave. That she'd been sharp, independent, even stubborn. But official records started using different words: disoriented, vulnerable, missing due to mental confusion. The case file was reclassified as presumed death, unknown circumstances. The reclassification was subtle, but devastating. It meant fewer follow-ups, fewer resources, no active leads, just status updates sent every 6 months to a family already fraying at the edges. Janet's relationship with her brother Brian had all but collapsed. He blamed her for not watching Evelyn closely enough. She accused him of abandoning them. The last time he visited the farmhouse, he stood in the yard for less than 2 minutes before getting back in his rental car. He didn't even go up the steps. Inside, Janet's world shrank. The porch chair became a boundary line. Some mornings she'd just stare at it, not even realizing the sun had moved until it was late afternoon. Neighbors offered help, yard work, grocery runs, even counseling, but most of them eventually gave up. There wasn't much they could do for someone who didn't want anything changed. Lila started visiting less. It wasn't that she didn't care. She did, but the house felt heavier every time she came back. She said it was like stepping into a room where something had just happened, even though nothing ever did. Once, she asked her mother to move the chair. Just try. Just once. Janet refused. The answer wasn't angry, but final. One night that fall, a storm rolled over Hollow Ridge. The wind peeled a corner of the roof clean off, sending shingles into the fields. Water leaked through the attic. Janet didn't notice until 2 days later. By then, the damage had soaked down into the ceiling. But she didn't call anyone to fix it. The rain had come and gone, and the house, like the rest of them, just endured it. And still, no one sat in that chair. The paint on the porch had nearly worn away, but the legs of the wicker rocker left faint indentations where they always had. Perfectly spaced, untouched. The wind would nudge it sometimes, enough to make it sway. And every time it did, Janet would stop whatever she was doing and look up, just for a second, as if maybe this time it meant something. But no one ever came up the steps, and no one ever sat down. It was early October, 3 years after Evelyn Mercer vanished, when a man named Carl Denton made a call to the sheriff's office from a trailhead just outside Calhoun County. Carl was a weekend hiker, not serious, just someone who liked to get out of town and into the hills when the weather was decent. That morning he'd taken an unfamiliar route that traced the edge of a steep ravine, a place known more to hunters than hikers. About 6 miles north of the Mercer property, deep off the marked path, he spotted something lodged between 2 rocks, half covered in mud and pine needles, frayed around the edges but clearly man-made. It was a slipper, small, tan-colored, open-backed, the kind an older woman might wear. By the time investigators arrived, Carl had already cleared the area around it, trying not to disturb anything more than he had to. What caught their attention immediately was the make, same brand, same size, identical to the pair Evelyn had last been seen wearing. It was degraded, 3 years of rain, sun, and rot, but still recognizable. They bagged it, took photos, and cordoned off the surrounding area. For the first time in nearly 100 days, the Mercer case file was reopened. The ravine was rugged, lined with jagged shale and fallen trees. A dried creek bed wound through it, fed only during heavy storms. Deputies called in cadaver dogs the next morning. The air was cold, damp, visibility low. The dogs reacted about 100 yards downstream, noses locked on the edge of the dried channel, tails stiff. They moved with purpose, circling one particular bend over and over. The handler marked the location. Investigators set up a grid. Hope flickered back to life. But the weather turned fast. Within 48 hours, a front rolled in from the west. The rain came hard and fast, flooding the ravine. Whatever scent had been there was washed away. The ground shifted. Loose rocks fell. By the weekend, access to the exact spot the dogs had indicated was dangerous, even for trained teams. The search was paused, then postponed, then quietly shelved. No remains were found, no other personal items, just the slipper. It was enough to confirm a possibility. Evelyn had made it at least that far, somehow. Whether she'd walked, been carried, or left behind, no one could say for sure. The discovery reignited the central debate. If she'd wandered into the woods on her own, how did she make it over 6 miles across uneven terrain, some of it nearly vertical? If someone had taken her, why leave her, or anything, out there? A small team returned once the rain stopped, but it was mostly a formality. The ground had been churned into thick sludge. Any evidence that might have existed was now buried or gone. They found no bones, no fabric, no signs of a camp or shelter, just a quiet stretch of forest, soaked and eroded. News of the slipper spread quickly through the town. For a few weeks, it was all anyone talked about. Some saw it as validation, proof that Evelyn hadn't been taken far. Others thought it was a plant or a mistake. A woman her age wouldn't have survived long in those woods, they said, especially not in slippers. Some wondered if the shoe had been dropped there recently, placed as a distraction, but no one could prove anything. And like every other lead before it, the trail eventually went cold. Back at the Mercer property, the discovery hit Janet hard. She'd never truly accepted that her mother was gone, not without proof. The slipper gave her something tangible to hold on to, but it also sharpened the grief. Now there was evidence of suffering, evidence that Evelyn had likely died alone, lost or abandoned in the wilderness. Janet clung to the search updates, called the sheriff's office weekly for months, asked about soil samples, dental comparisons, rescans. But the calls grew shorter each time. There were no remains. There was no crime scene. And there was no plan to go back. Lila had just started college when the news reached her. She came home that weekend, stood in the backyard with her mother, both staring out past the fields as if they could see that ravine from there. Neither of them said much. What was there to say? A slipper in the mud wasn't closure. It was a reminder that whatever had happened on the porch that day hadn't stayed there. It had traveled quietly into the forest and left almost nothing behind. The Mercer farmhouse had become a kind of landmark by then. Kids from neighboring towns dared each other to drive past it at night. Stories circulated, sightings, voices, flickering porch lights. None of it was real. But in a place like Hollow Ridge, mystery becomes folklore fast, and people like Evelyn, once known, become symbols. To some, she was the woman who got taken. To others, she was the woman who walked into the woods and never came back. But to Janet, she was still just her mother. The woman who drank iced tea on summer afternoons, who folded dish towels a certain way, who had once told her in passing that she hated storms, and that would matter more than anyone realized, because 3 years later, it would be another storm that brought the truth back to the surface. It was early spring when Lila found the photo. She hadn't been looking for anything specific, just flipping through an old family album during a weekend visit home. Her mother kept it stored on the bottom shelf of the hallway cabinet beneath stacks of newspaper clippings and unsent Christmas cards. The photo was dated just 3 weeks before Evelyn disappeared, a birthday cookout for Lila's younger cousin taken in the backyard of the Mercer farmhouse. It showed Lila, age 14, sitting at the picnic table with a plate of watermelon in her lap, squinting into the sun. Behind her, the fields stretched out into shadow, a hazy line of trees marking the edge of the property. It wasn't until later that night, when she took a photo of the image with her phone and zoomed in, that she noticed the shape near the tree line. A man, barely visible, half in shadow, partially blocked by a patch of brush. He stood with his arms at his sides, facing the house, not walking, not moving, just watching. He wore dark overalls, work boots, something slung over one shoulder. His face wasn't clear, but the outline was human, deliberate, present, and not part of the party. Lila brought the photo to her mother the next morning. Janet stared at it for a long time without speaking. She didn't recognize the figure. No one had mentioned a visitor that day. No one in the family owned overalls like that. Janet called the sheriff's office that afternoon, and the image was submitted to the department for analysis. But without a clear face, no movement, and no additional photos from the same angle, they labeled it inconclusive. Possibly a trick of the light, possibly a person, no definitive conclusions. But someone else did recognize it. A few days later, Janet mentioned the photo to a friend of Evelyn's, a woman named Ruth from the church quilting circle. Ruth had been around the farm for decades, back when Evelyn and her late husband still kept seasonal help during harvest. She studied the photo for less than a minute before she gave a name: Gerald Pike. A hired hand who worked the Mercer property in the late 80s and early 90s, lived in a trailer out near Dog Hollow, tall, wiry, always wore dark overalls even in the summer. Ruth remembered him because he had a temper, one of those quiet, brooding types, never caused trouble directly, but made people uneasy. Evelyn let him go after a year, said he made her nervous. When the sheriff's office pulled old employment records, there it was, Gerald Pike, hired 1989, dismissed 1990. No criminal history in Hollow Ridge, but a few mentions in surrounding counties. Disturbance calls, a trespassing complaint. No convictions. Then, nothing. He'd disappeared from public records around 2003. No recent address, no listed phone. Off the grid. The discovery lit a fuse under the case again. For the first time in years, investigators had a new name to pursue. Deputies reached out to contacts in Tennessee and neighboring states, sent faxes to state patrol offices, cross-referenced DMV databases. Nothing current came back. The last known vehicle registered to Pike was a beat-up Chevy pickup, red, no plates, matching the one reported by the neighbor on the day Evelyn vanished. But the truck had never been located. That connection alone wasn't enough to name him a suspect. Technically, Gerald hadn't done anything, at least not on record. But the image in the photo, the proximity to the Mercer property, the vehicle match, and the timing, it was enough to justify a regional alert. Detectives began tracking down anyone who'd known him. A former drinking buddy remembered Pike talking about Evelyn once, years ago, said she'd been the only person who treated him like he mattered. Another claimed Gerald blamed Evelyn's late husband for cheating him out of a harvest share. The stories were conflicting, spotty, and vague, but none of them ruled him out. Lila started researching Pike on her own. She pulled property records, court filings, news archives. She found a blurry booking photo from 1992 showing a man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. It matched the posture and body shape in the photo. She brought it to the sheriff's office. Again, they said it wasn't definitive, but the theory started to stick. In the absence of evidence, people need shape. Gerald gave the story a shape. The townspeople leaned into it. Hollow Ridge started treating Gerald like a ghost story. The farmhand who watched from the woods, who waited 18 years to return. Janet hated the rumors, but part of her also felt something shift. For the first time, someone outside her family believed Evelyn's disappearance wasn't just an accident. It had weight again. It had a name. But without a location, without a confirmed sighting, there was nowhere to go. Gerald Pike had vanished, just like Evelyn. No paper trail. No relatives who knew where he'd gone. It was like he'd walked into the woods and never came out. Still, the seed had been planted. The photo, the truck, the forgotten history. Something had been near the house in the weeks before. Evelyn disappeared. Something, or someone, standing just far enough away to go unnoticed. Just close enough to come back. And not far from that same tree line, almost a decade later, something else would appear. Not a shadow this time, not a rumor, but something buried beneath the ground, waiting to be uncovered. By 2020, the Mercer farmhouse had started to fall in on itself. The roof sagged in places, the porch steps bowed at the center, window screens hung loose in their frames. Janet still refused to leave. She'd turned down every offer from developers and flippers, even as property values in the county began to rise. Neighbors stopped asking. The local post office didn't bother delivering to the front door anymore. They just left mail in a rusted box nailed to the fence. To most of Hollow Ridge, the Mercer place had become a relic, something between a ghost story and a tragedy too old to talk about. But for Janet, it was still home, or at least it was still the place where her mother had last existed. She lived alone, with only 2 dogs for company. She kept the same routines: coffee at dawn, rocking chair at dusk. She rarely answered the phone, didn't use email. Lila, now in her late 20s, visited when she could, but the visits grew shorter. It was hard to watch her mother in that house, still clinging to a silence that had never broken. Then the noises started. It was small things at first. The front door would creak open late at night, even when latched. The dogs would start barking toward the back fields, for no clear reason, sometimes growling at an empty corner of the kitchen. Janet chalked it up to age, the house settling, the wind. But it kept happening. Once, she found the screen door wide open at dawn, though she was sure she'd locked it. Another time, she heard footsteps on the porch at 3 a.m., heavy and slow. She sat in the dark, holding her breath, but no one knocked. No one said a word. She didn't call the police. She never did. After so many years without answers, she'd stopped believing they could provide any. It wasn't until the neighbor, Drew Kepler, stopped by one afternoon that something shifted. He'd come to return a garden rake and mentioned the noises in passing, said his own dogs had been acting strange too, barking at the woods behind their property line, pacing near the shed. He offered to set up a motion-activated camera just to see. Janet agreed, more out of politeness than expectation. He installed it that weekend, just before dusk. A single lens pointed toward the edge of the field, covering the tree line and most of the front yard. It ran silently through the night, captured wind, deer, the occasional raccoon. Then, 3 nights later, at exactly 3:12 a.m., it caught something else. A man, tall, thin. Wearing a heavy coat despite the summer heat, he moved slowly across the edge of the trees, not toward the house but along the perimeter. His head stayed down. His arms hung loosely by his sides. The footage was grainy, distorted slightly by moisture, but it was clear enough to see that he didn't belong there. Drew sent the clip to Janet, who brought it straight to the sheriff's office. The department reviewed it, enhanced it, ran it against facial recognition databases, no clear match. But one deputy, old enough to remember the early days of the Mercer investigation, pulled up the last known booking photo of Gerald Pike. Side by side, the resemblance was there. The same hunched posture, the same long frame, the same sunken cheeks. Still, the image wasn't proof. There was no criminal act captured on camera, no entry, no trespassing, just a man walking through a field in the middle of the night. And Pike had never been charged with anything related to Evelyn's disappearance. The case had gone cold without a suspect. That hadn't changed. Law enforcement labeled the incident as unconfirmed presence. They didn't follow up. But Janet did. She began walking the property at night, flashlight in hand, scanning the tree line. She left porch lights on again, something she hadn't done since the first year Evelyn went missing. She started keeping the dogs inside after dark, not because she feared for them, but because she didn't want them chasing shadows. She wasn't afraid, not anymore, just restless, as if she could sense that something or someone was circling closer than before. Lila, when she saw the footage, didn't speak for nearly a full minute. Then she asked a question that no one could answer. Why come back now? After all these years, what would bring someone like Gerald Pike back to Hollow Ridge? If it was him, what was he looking for? Theories surfaced again. Maybe he never left. Maybe he'd been living nearby all along, off-grid, sleeping in barns, watching the house from the woods. Maybe he'd buried something. Maybe he was checking to see if it had been found. The questions had no answers. Not yet. But later that year, in the fall, a brutal storm would sweep across the county, flooding fields, tearing up roadbeds, and collapsing the northern slope behind the Mercer house. It would uncover something the earth had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades, and once again, Hollow Ridge would have no choice but to remember. In March of 2025, the storm came without much warning. A stalled front hung over eastern Tennessee for 3 days, dumping more than 12 inches of rain across Calhoun County. Hollow Ridge, sitting low and vulnerable between ridgelines, took the worst of it. Creeks turned into rushing channels, culverts overflowed, power flickered on and off for hours at a time. And at the edge of the Mercer property, where the yard sloped down into the tree line, the saturated ground finally gave out. Janet didn't even hear it happen. She was inside with the dogs, trying to bail out water from the back door threshold. The sound was lost in the roar of wind and rain hammering the tin roof. It wasn't until the next morning, when the storm finally moved east, that she noticed what had changed. Behind the house, about 40 feet downhill, near the edge of what had once been a garden shed, the land had collapsed. The shed itself was gone, swallowed entirely into the earth. What remained was a jagged, muddy pit, 12 feet wide and deeper than anyone wanted to guess. Lila, who had driven up as soon as roads reopened, stood with her mother at the edge of the sinkhole, boots sinking into the ankle. At first, it just looked like dirt and splintered debris, but something about the shape caught her attention. Wood, but not from the shed. Flat, structured, squared beams, and metal, hinges, large, rusted, and bolted into place. The more they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't the remains of the shed. This was something else. something built long before either of them had lived there. They called the sheriff's office that afternoon. Deputies arrived the next morning, cautious but curious. The discovery didn't match any known structure on the original property plans. The Mercer family had owned the land since the late 1950s, but building permits from that time were sparse and incomplete. No one had mentioned a second cellar. The only one anyone had ever used was on the west side of the house, under the kitchen. This one was buried out back, concealed, sealed, and until now, completely forgotten. Excavation began slowly. The soil was unstable. Investigators brought in a forensic team from Knoxville just in case. As they worked their way through the wreckage, a staircase emerged, narrow, made of old timber, worn and water damaged. The cellar door had been reinforced with iron latches on the outside, designed to lock from above, not from within. When they finally cleared enough debris to access the opening, the smell hit first. Not fresh, not overwhelming, just a heavy, musty stillness, like a place that hadn't breathed air in decades. The team suited up and entered carefully, shining lights into the dark. Inside was a single room, maybe 10 by 10 feet. Dirt floor, wooden shelves along one wall, empty. In the corner, under what looked like an old blanket, they found what no one wanted to say aloud: human remains. The body was partially decomposed, mostly skeletal, surrounded by rusted tin cans and fragments of fabric. But next to it, in the dirt, they found something else. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses, small, delicate, and unmistakable. The same glasses Evelyn Mercer had worn every day of her life. The ones Janet had kept on her nightstand for weeks after she disappeared. The ones she never believed she'd see again. The scene was immediately sealed. Forensics began collecting evidence, soil samples, bone fragments. The cellar was photographed, scanned, cataloged piece by piece. Janet and Lila weren't allowed near it after that. They waited at the house, pacing silently between rooms that had grown impossibly quiet. For years they had begged for answers. Now the land was giving one up, slowly, one layer at a time. The sheriff's office held a press conference 2 days later. They confirmed that remains had been found on the Mercer property. That identification was pending, that no conclusions would be drawn until the investigation was complete. But behind the formal tone, everyone knew what it meant. Evelyn hadn't wandered into the woods. She hadn't been taken far. She had been here all along, buried beneath the home she'd lived in for more than 30 years, locked away in a space no one knew existed or no one wanted to remember. The discovery changed the shape of the case. What had once been classified as a missing persons file was now something else entirely. The cellar had been sealed from the outside, the door reinforced. Whoever had placed Evelyn in that space had done so with the intent that she wouldn't get out or be found. Not for a long time. There were questions, of course. Why had no one searched that part of the property sooner? Why wasn't the cellar on any map? And most important, who had known it was there? Those answers would come eventually, but not yet. For now, all Janet could do was sit on the porch, staring out at the place where the land had opened up and finally told the truth. Not the whole truth, not yet, but just enough to prove one thing. Evelyn Mercer had never left Hollow Ridge. She had been waiting, just beneath the surface, for someone to find her. The forensic team worked in tight silence. The air inside the sealed cellar was thick and motionless, tinged with decay and rot, but it was the stillness that made it heavy. As the light bounced off the dirt-packed walls and rusted beams, it was clear this space hadn't been disturbed in decades. No airflow, no wildlife, no sun. It had existed entirely apart from the world above it, buried not just physically, but deliberately. And in the far corner of that hidden room, curled against the back wall, they found her. The remains were skeletal, partially mummified from years of entombment in dry soil and darkness. She had been wearing a light cotton dress, remnants of which clung to brittle fragments of fabric near the pelvis and shoulder. No shoes. The bones were arranged in a fetal position, knees pulled inward, one hand still near the ribcage. But it was what lay beside her that confirmed what many already suspected, a pair of small, wire-rimmed glasses. Slightly bent, one lens cracked, but unmistakably hers. Evelyn Mercer had been found. The room itself was primitive, no insulation, just packed earth and rotted wood. On the far wall, claw marks were etched into the inside of the cellar door, desperate, chaotic gouges carved into the grain, dozens of them. And that changed everything. It meant she had been alive when the door closed, not dead and hidden, alive, trapped. There was no mistaking what it implied. Evelyn had not wandered off. She had not died in the woods. She had been locked underground. In a corner shelf, investigators recovered a stack of rusted tin cans. Most had labels too weathered to read, but a few still bore the faded markings of canned vegetables and peaches. Nearby, under a collapsed board, a journal was discovered, its cover warped with moisture, pages fragile to the touch. The ink had run in many places, but sections remained legible. The entries were written in Evelyn's distinct, neat handwriting. At first, they were dated. Day 1, Day 2. Then, the entries became less structured. Notes about the cold, about noises above, about someone promising to return. Then, silence. The final entry, faint but visible, read, "Don't know what day. He hasn't come back. I don't think he's coming back." The medical examiner confirmed the remains through dental records the following week. There was no evidence of blunt trauma or visible injury. Cause of death was listed as dehydration and starvation, consistent with long-term confinement. Time of death was estimated within weeks of her disappearance. She had survived for at least several days, possibly more, before succumbing in total isolation beneath her own home. The cellar had no light, no vent, no means of escape. There was only one entrance, the heavy trap door that had been bolted from above. What confused investigators was how a structure like that had existed without being documented. There were no blueprints, no permits. Old neighbors were interviewed again. Most claimed they'd never known the cellar existed. A few older locals said there had been talk, years ago, about a storm shelter built before the main house was added, back when the property was little more than a farming shed and a few livestock pens. But if anyone had ever known it was there, the knowledge had died with them. Until the storm unearthed it, the place hadn't existed in any official record. Janet was told in person. The detective who'd stayed loosely attached to the case over the years drove out himself. He sat with her at the kitchen table and said the words slowly, carefully, as if saying them fast would somehow make it worse. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked to see the journal, just to hold it. They told her it had to stay in evidence for now, but they let her read a few pages through clear plastic. Her fingers hovered just above the words. She didn't cry. But she didn't move either. Lila processed it differently. She kept asking how it could have happened, not why. How? How did Evelyn end up in a cellar no one knew existed? How did no one hear her? How could someone leave her there? Those weren't the questions investigators could answer yet. The evidence raised more suspicions than it settled, because to lock someone away and never return was more than a mistake. It was a decision. The cellar had been sealed tightly. Whoever did it had bolted the door shut from the outside and concealed the trap beneath soil, brush, and a shed that had likely been placed directly over it to keep it hidden. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't neglect. It was intentional. And now, with Evelyn identified, the case was no longer classified as missing persons. It was officially reopened as a criminal investigation. But suspicion without proof is weightless. The journal mentioned no names. The scratches on the door said nothing about who walked away. And the person who might have known, who might have once promised to come back, was still just a blurred figure in a decades-old photo, a name that surfaced now and again like a ripple in water. Gerald Pike. And while no one had seen him in years, the ground hadn't yet finished telling its story. Because once Evelyn was found, the next question was no longer where, it was who. The lab results came back 5 days after the forensic team submitted the samples from the cellar door. Amid the corrosion and splintered wood, they had recovered 2 partial fingerprints, one left smudged across the top beam, the other pressed into the rusted edge of the outer latch. The match was slow to confirm, but when it did, it landed with the weight of something final. Gerald Pike. It had been decades since his prints were entered into the system, from a misdemeanor charge filed in Meigs County in 1992. No one had heard from him in years, no known address, no tax records, no driver's license renewals. He was officially a ghost. but the prints were enough to reopen a long dormant interest, and this time it was personal. The man whose name had haunted the Mercer case, the figure lurking at the edge of that backyard photo, had now been physically tied to the last place Evelyn was seen alive. Law enforcement escalated the search quickly. His name and face were circulated through regional networks and local press. Tip lines were reopened. For the first few days, nothing. Then a call came from a small town in Missouri, nearly 400 miles west of Hollow Ridge. A woman who worked the register at a feed store said she recognized the photo. She knew him as Randy Booker, a quiet older man who lived in a weathered trailer just outside of town. Paid cash, kept to himself, fixed tractors, disappeared for days at a time. Authorities moved in quietly. When they arrived, the trailer was empty. They found signs of recent occupation, food on the counter, a jacket on the hook, fresh tire tracks in the mud. But no Gerald. He was picked up 3 towns over, walking alone along a rural access road, holding a gas can. He didn't resist, barely spoke, just nodded when they said his name. Back in Tennessee, investigators prepared for a confession, but that's not what they got. In the interrogation room, Gerald denied killing Evelyn. He didn't claim innocence outright. He admitted being on the Mercer property in 2007. Admitted seeing Evelyn. But what he told them next was harder to understand. He said Evelyn had asked him for help, that she was scared, that she wanted to disappear for a little while. According to Gerald, Evelyn believed someone was coming for her, someone she didn't trust. She didn't want to involve the police. She just wanted to feel safe. Gerald told detectives that she had begged him to hide her until it was over. So, he said, he took her to the old storm cellar behind the house. He said he stocked it with canned goods, a blanket, and a lantern. He said he promised to come back the next morning. Then, with no warning, his voice cracked. The facade dropped. And what came out wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was guilt. He said he never made it back. That same night, hours after he sealed the door, he was picked up in Georgia on an outstanding warrant for probation violation. He served 5 months in county jail under an alias. By the time he got out, he said, he thought it was too late. When asked why he didn't say anything to anyone, not to the police, not even anonymously, he just stared at the floor. He said he thought about it every day, that he told himself she must have gotten out, that someone must have found her, that if she hadn't, it was already done. It didn't explain everything. It didn't explain the scratches on the inside of the door. It didn't explain why no one heard her screams. But it shifted the story again, from murder to something more complicated. Investigators pressed him further. Why would Evelyn trust him? What was she afraid of? That's when Gerald said the name no one expected. Brian Mercer, Janet's brother. Evelyn's only son. He told detectives Evelyn had confided in him weeks before she vanished, that Brian had been released from prison earlier that summer and had shown up at the farmhouse, that he'd gotten angry, about money, about something Evelyn wouldn't give him. Gerald said Evelyn told him she didn't feel safe, that she didn't want to report it because she didn't want to see her son go back to prison. She thought if she stayed hidden for a while, he'd go away. Brian had been convicted in 2001 for assault and drug charges. He served 6 years and was released in mid-June 2007, a detail that matched Gerald's timeline. At the time of Evelyn's disappearance, Brian was in the area. He'd visited Janet briefly the day before Evelyn vanished. That had never been public knowledge. With this new information, investigators tracked Brian down. He was living in a halfway house outside Knoxville, clean record since 2009, worked odd jobs, hadn't spoken to Janet in years. When questioned, he denied threatening Evelyn, said he had visited once, yes, but just to say hello. Claimed Evelyn had been kind, distant, but not afraid. There wasn't enough to charge him with anything, and Gerald, despite what he'd done, wasn't confessing to murder. The DA's office faced a dilemma. Gerald had locked a woman in a cellar, knowingly, and never returned. She died as a result. But his story painted a murky picture, not malice, but negligence, not violence, but cowardice. Still, the law called it manslaughter. He was arrested and held without bail. But even with a man in custody and a confession on record, the story wasn't finished, because Gerald had one more thing to say. something he'd never told anyone, something buried deeper than the cellar. And when he finally said it, the entire timeline would unravel and reveal the one mistake that changed everything. When detectives reviewed the last entries in Evelyn's recovered journal, the context finally came into focus. One line stood out. "Brian came back. I told Gerald not to let him hurt us." It was dated just one day before Evelyn Mercer disappeared. The name, Brian, wasn't new to investigators. They had spoken to Janet's brother early in the case, briefly, when Evelyn first vanished. At the time, he claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks. But now, with Evelyn's own handwriting contradicting that, police took a closer look. Old visitor logs from a gas station less than a mile from the Mercer property showed a Brian Mercer signature time-stamped the day before Evelyn went missing. A receipt confirmed a fuel purchase at 10:43 a.m. The station's owner didn't remember him, but it didn't matter. The date matched Evelyn's note, and it proved what investigators now suspected. Brian had been at the farm. Confronted with the timeline and Evelyn's words, Gerald finally gave a full confession. It wasn't loud or defiant. It was slow, almost hollow. He admitted Evelyn had asked him for help. She said she was afraid Brian would come back and hurt her. She didn't want police involved, just needed somewhere to hide until things calmed down. Gerald knew about the old cellar buried behind the shed. He cleared it out, stocked it with food, and locked the door behind her on the afternoon of July 18th, promising to return the next morning. But that night, he was picked up across the state line in Georgia for an unrelated warrant, failure to appear on a minor probation charge. He was held for 5 months. No phone call, no bail, no way to get back to Hollow Ridge. And when he finally did return, the shed above the cellar had collapsed in a storm. The land had shifted. He told police he stood over the spot and realized what had happened. He panicked. He couldn't bring himself to dig, so he walked away. There had been no abduction, no killer in the woods, no stranger in the night. Evelyn had died waiting for someone she trusted to come back, and he never did. Police reclassified the case from missing persons to negligent homicide. Gerald pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter. Brian Mercer was never charged. There was no evidence he had returned after that visit, and no indication he knew what his mother had planned. But the journal made clear, Evelyn's fear was real. And that fear is what started the chain of events that led to her death. In the end, the storm that ripped through Hollow Ridge hadn't just unearthed a buried room. It had uncovered the weight of silence, of secrets kept in the name of family, and a promise that was never fulfilled. Evelyn Mercer didn't vanish. She was hidden by fear and by someone who thought he was protecting her. And she stayed hidden until the land itself finally let her be found.